Warning: some of the blizzard power outage survival tactics used by the household described pose safety hazards, should not be followed, do not constitute advice to viewers, but are merely described for the purpose of comparing these improvised methods to lower tech solutions from our past, and is a platform for musing on mental and political attitudes necessary to cope with an unraveling climate. Hello and welcome back to Vox Terra. Today I want to bring some lessons learned from a viewer who survived one of these power outages brought on by extreme weather, as well as lessons learned from the COVID pandemic, and sort of tie it together. For one, looking at low-tech solutions to our personal problems and environmental problems, and then looking at what's the message here for society from these extreme weather events and how to cope with them, both from a policy point of view, politics, as well as what I call the true left, meaning those who are sort of challenging consumer capitalism or the dominance of these powerful corporations in our society, and a religious perspective or a biblically based perspective, because I think it's really important to get past these culture war divides that I think are largely artificial and show that commonality to bring the long-term survival of our species as a political agenda for everyone. And then lastly, just attitudinal, the attitude about dealing with this changing climate. So this viewer told me her family survived like 4 days and maybe 3 nights without heat or power, basically, during the cold. So first solution, you're going to look at keeping your body warm. And in that case, her family did layers, lots of layers. And here we can think about, well, going back to the 1700s and how people kept warm when there wasn't central heating in the cold. You'd have images of Bob Cratchit or somebody with some kind of a nightcap on and gloves with fingers cut out for the fingers cut out of the gloves so you can still touch things, but your hands are warm. Down blankets and multiple blankets. So now you could think of the older time low-tech solution of when beds used to have canopies over them, some type of heavy cloth to keep in the body's natural heat. So there, that bed with a canopy over it mimics maybe the solution of, setting up a tent in your own home and having to sleep in there to help capture that heat. Another solution her family did was putting the food, so the food wouldn't spoil, into natural cold storage, meaning putting that food in containers and then stuffing it in a snowbank, but making sure it's protected from critters by maybe putting it in a garbage tote temporarily overnight, but keeping that food cold. Well, that brings us back to the days when there used to be something called root cellars, taking advantage of the Earth's natural stable temperature when you go deep enough below ground. Remember, that's also a good source for something called geothermal heating and cooling, another more low power consumptive technology to keep the home comfortable. And when we think about cold storage, we can go back to those days of when there was something called ice boxes, in the really old times, and there would be an ice delivery to put in the ice box to keep the food cold without power consumption again. Well, remember the days when a phonograph had, we can't remember those days, but we have the imagery in our head of when the phonograph, the early record player, was hand cranked, wind up technology. In fact, even during my childhood, a lot more things operated on wind up technology, watches, clocks. So here her family brought out a hand crank, wind up emergency radio. The concept of passive solar heating has been circulating around among those concerned about the environment, yet buildings have not been designed with that in mind, even though it's been out there for a long time. So they took advantage of passive solar heating, opening the curtains by day to let in that warmer sunlight, get some natural heat, then close them at night to trap that heat in. Passive solar heating. Now, I'm not advocating natural gas stoves because most of the environmental movement is calling for going towards electrification to get away from fossil fuels. But that family did have a natural gas stove, and the ability to start a fire indoors by just turning on that gas spigot allowed them to then do some low level of cooking, heating hot water, stay a bit warmer that way. But here you got to be really careful because there's carbon monoxide poisoning. People have died from that during power outages by running their gas stove for warmth. And two, remember in the case of Texas, power outages during the cold, a lot of their gas lines froze. So a more ideal low-tech solution would be something called a solar cooker, or a temporary backup, having a wood-burning pellet stove or wood-burning stove for temporary emergency use. And you could argue, if somebody's actually using so little power, they're not running anything at nighttime, that the offset of that burning from a wood cooker is probably more than offset by the overall reduced use of power and fuel. Well, the lack of power meant, no one in that household's getting screen time. So then that family had to entertain themselves the way people did in the old times. In the old days, before electricity and power, people would have maybe song sheets or music sheets they would buy, and they would sing. Now, before I move on to societal implications, I just want to give you a couple of safety tips. If you live in a colder climate and you're worried about losing power, you should drip those water faucets so your pipes don't freeze. That'll reduce the freezing, because flowing water doesn't freeze as easily. Your vehicle, you should have a candle and a blanket in it at all times. That's how some people either froze to death in their cars during these blizzards or died of carbon monoxide poisoning because they're running their engine. So let's talk about politics and society. Well, another thing during both the COVID closures and if you live in a place where there's a driving ban because of a blizzard or some extreme weather event, suddenly everything's very quiet. Suddenly the air is much cleaner. Well, that should have been a screaming message where maybe people need to rest and take a pause. Well, one, let's look at why we don't have more low-tech solutions like passive solar heating or passive solar design in buildings, or really any of these more greener technologies like geothermal heating and cooling, or even solar panels or the battery backup. Why do these things seem more costly relative towards just burning fuel all the time? Well, there's two big problems in our capitalist economy. One is just aggregations of money influence the politics, influence the media, so the public's barely aware of this, that these industries, the oil and gas industry I'm talking about here, get all types of subsidies, the pipelines, but another subsidy, not a direct subsidy like a tax break or tax abatement or using the government for eminent domain to run a pipeline through, is something called market externalities, meaning the cost of the product is just pushed out on the public at large, the true cost. So when you burn that fuel, when you burn that natural gas or that gasoline doesn't include the price of the lung disease, all that particulate matter people are breathing in, the additional cancers due to the benzene and the carcinogens, or the greenhouse gases and the overall destabilizing of our climate. So because of this political dynamic, this economic political dynamic, these healthier options, lower polluting options, are not favored by the marketplace. They're made to artificially, by subsidies, by market externalities, seem more costly. And now we have attitude, people's attitude towards these events and what they're dealing with. Well, one thing we hear about looting during these extreme weather events, and to me that ties in with what got us here in the first place. It's all this burning of fossil fuels that's set the heating of our planet in motion, the destabilizing of our climate. And that is at least in part due to not only that political dynamic I talked about, which would be more of a leftist critique, but now from a biblical critique, this refusal to stop, this refusal to pause. Now, a lot of, spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs incorporate that. Like Zen Buddhism talks about that need to just pause and stop and observe. So here in the Bible, it calls for a Sabbath. You rest on that Sabbath, you shut things down. We know about that, every Sunday or Saturday, depending on which religious tradition. But really underreported is that once every 7-year Sabbath, where the whole land is supposed to rest. You're supposed to basically close things down for a whole year once every 7 years. Well, that really doesn't fit in with this frenetic, nonstop consumer capitalism. So you can see how really the godly perspective could actually fit in quite nicely with a leftist perspective if the two weren't somehow atomized against each other. Rather, give some space on some of those culture war issues where you disagree on. Because as this climate's heating and unraveling, it's people's inability to follow rules is going to really be a problem. And how are people going to all agree, hey, you know what? Let's close things down for the night and take it easy and stop polluting for a little while. How are they going to agree to this with the current culture we have right now? They only agreed to it years ago, in maybe the early days of my childhood, in times before I was born, due to that religious or almost like a theocratic influence. And if people were willing to both listen to a more, leftist critique or liberal environmentalist critique with the environment, going back to Jimmy Carter, who said, hey, put on a sweater, don't burn so much fossil fuels, drive slower, don't burn so much fossil fuels, let's put on solar panels on the White House, don't burn so much fossil fuels. But they didn't. A lot of people elected Reagan who took those solar panels off. And he wasn't advocating wearing a sweater, okay? So if we had just been willing to slow, or we kept those blue laws in place, everything's closed, okay, there'd be a lot less pollution. We wouldn't be sitting here today burning past what could have been an era of peace and plenty into entering an era of constant disaster, preparedness, relief, and bailout. That's what we're setting up now, we in quotes here, because I've been warning about this my whole lifetime, for the Gen Zs, for the younger generations. So lastly, with attitude, and again, if somebody's looking at death due to this natural disaster, that's going to be really hard to have a good attitude. But if they're looking at a dealable situation, then what got me okay with masking up, what's gotten me through power outages with a cheerful spirit, was that I looked around when all this stuff is closed and that traffic stopped and it's quiet and the lights are off and the stars shone brighter and the air was cleaner. I said, hey, are more people, are you getting the message, people? You got to take some breaks. You got to slow down. You got to think of what's the meaning of this life, and stop just plowing your whole purpose and meaning into whatever this consumeristic capitalist media is telling you who you are. Well, hey, I hope you found this analysis helpful, interesting, and if so, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel, you're commenting, you're liking. Thank you to my 2 patrons of Patreon, helping someday make this effort sustainable for me personally by donating. Remember to subscribe. And as always, until next time, peace be with you.